This is about the Thames Tunnel, but it's mostly my talk about Isambard Kingdom Brunel. The Thames Tunnel was designed by Mark Brunel, his father, a Frenchman, but it is Isambard Kingdom Brunel's first project as a teenager working with his father. Isambard Kingdom Brunel has been called by many, and not just me, as the man who built the world. And you remember Jeremy Clarkson's wonderful summary of 19th century history, which was along the lines: Brunel built Britain, Britain built the world, therefore Brunel built the world. This is known as hyperbole. But there he is, famous photograph, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, standing in front of the chains that were used to launch his last project, the ship, the Great Eastern, Leviathan, or Sea Monster, launched in London on the Isle of Dogs, in the yards, built and launched in the yards of his colleague, and with whom he fell out spectacularly, John Scott Russell. The Great Eastern was the world's first ocean liner. It was an enormous ship. This, the shipbuilders say, is the ship that changed everything. The Great Britain has been lovingly restored, but if you speak to marine engineers, they'll tell you the Great Eastern is the really significant one. This is our first bulk carrier. This is the ship that changed the shape of the world. Isambard Kingdom Brunel also worked with his father, Sir Mark Brunel, on the Thames Tunnel, the first tunnel under a river anywhere in the world, designed to move cargo by horse and by cart, but now used by the London Overground on what was the East London Line, is now the East London Railway, part of the London Overground, and it is the oldest tunnel in the oldest underground system in the world. And it was here that the two Brunels pioneered a system of constructing tunnels that's been used in building metro systems all over the world ever since. So I'm speaking of a man who built with his father the oldest tunnel in the oldest underground system in the world, and who built on his own, well, with John Scott Russell, the ship that changed everything. Here's the Thames Tunnel, recently refurbished. And here is why it was necessary. In Brunel's day, the River Thames was the busiest river in the world. In Brunel's day, there were 3,000 tall-masted ships in the river every day. There were 10,000 little boats. You're looking at the biggest traffic jam in the world. And below the traffic jam, you see the Thames Tunnel. And in the Thames Tunnel, you see horses and carts moving cargo. This traffic jam was so bad, they say it took longer to get stuff across the Thames than it took to get stuff across the Atlantic. And this is, to remind you, designed to move cargo. We need to move cargo across the river without stopping the tall-masted ships from going further up the river. And this is where it began. This is the eighth wonder of the world. This is the beginnings of the works at the Thames Tunnel. This is in Rotherhithe, the site now of the Brunel Museum, which is built in Sir Mark Brunel's engine house. And there are three identifiable things you can see on the picture. On my side of the picture, you see the top of the world's first caisson. This was a huge 1,000-ton pastry cutter built on an iron ring and sunk into the soft earth by excavation below. Brunel was the first person to understand the best way to build below the ground is to build above the ground and sink it. On the far side of the picture is a bas-relief sculpture that Mark Brunel designed to help explain to visitors exactly how the works were progressing. The building on which the bas-relief sculpture was constructed is now gone, but you can see there are 36 small cages, and each cage is the size of a man. In front of each man there is a wall of planks. Each plank is held in place by metal poles. Each miner in each cage takes out the top 2 poles, takes out the plank, digs to 4 inches, which is about the size of a brick, replaces the plank, replaces the poles, extends them by 4 inches, braces them against the cage, and takes out the one below. Digs to 4 inches, replaces the plank, extends the poles, and takes out the one below. When the miner has done the whole of the wall in front of him, and the man above and below have done the same, then those 3 in a row are pushed forwards by screw jacks, like the jack you'd use to change the wheel of the car, but much bigger, of course, and moving sideways instead of up and down. And as the screw jacks push the cages forwards, then bricklayers working behind the frames build the tunnel wall. That bas-relief sculpture is the first design of the first TBM, or tunnel boring machine. Work began in 1825 and progressed very well. Within 2 years they were half the way under the river, but there was a flood. The tunnel flooded 5 times altogether. Thankfully, in the flood in May 1827, nobody was killed, but it's a public relations disaster. The Brunels take a diving bell and inspect the damage, drop clay bags into the river, plug the hole, pump the tunnel dry, but they can't begin again because they have no money. This is a fundraising event. It is the world's first underwater fundraising event. And those tables, covered in white damask, are in the tunnels where the trains now run. Foreground, you see Brunel, Mark Brunel on the left, and his son, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, on the right. This party was organised by the 19-year-old Isambard Kingdom Brunel. And the guests, in November 1827, dined sumptuously underneath the River Thames off silver platter and drank from crystal glass in a sumptuous banquet, and the first under a river anywhere in the world. At the end of the table you can see a red platform, and if you look closely you can just see above the platform the band of the Coldstream Guards, who performed patriotic music for them as they dined beneath the river. I just point out that the band of the Coldstream Guards are quite noisy above ground. There was no small talk at this dinner party. There wasn't even big talk. They just ate, drank, and silently prayed the band would run out of sheet music. And it's not clear how good the food was either, but as a piece of public relations, it is brilliant. If it's safe enough to have a dinner party down there, it is safe enough for you, as potential investors, to take up a second subscription of shares. And that's what happened. Within weeks, the work began again. And weeks later, it stopped. 12 weeks after the fabulous banquet, there was a second flood, and this time 6 men died. This was a terrible incident. 6 men died, and Isambard King of Brunel nearly drowned in the underground chamber. Even those who weren't dying were suffering. The doctors of the time called it tunnel sickness, and the symptoms were skin complaints, blindness, temporary or permanent, respiratory failure, madness, temporary or permanent, and a nice detail, I think, rotting fingernails. So it's the worst job in the world. But just because people are dying and suffering doesn't mean we can't make jokes. The tunnel was lampooned ferociously by many newspapers and broadsheets. This is called an interesting little tunnel, and this is a cartoon by Robert Cruikshank. If the name is familiar, it's because George Cruikshank illustrated much of Dickens. An amusing little flood. Thomas Hood, who edited a literary journal, wrote an ode to Monsieur Brunel, and I won't recite it, but it is here in this excellent book. And what Hood says to Mark Brunel is, you will never reach the other side of the river, but you're French, so you could put wine racks down there. And this is a very early example of what I like to call the up yours de laws school of British journalism, which you may have thought was invented by the Sun. But I'm here to tell you that as long as there have been British newspapers and as long as there have been Frenchmen, there have been those kind of scurrilous headlines. But the job was finished. This is a watercolour by Mark Brunel of the tunnel. And I point out that it's very different to the one I showed you a while ago, which showed the Thames crowded with shipping. This is very different. Instead of 3,000 tall-masted ships and 10,000 little boats, you have one single rowing boat. And instead of tunnels crowded with carts moving cargo, you have pedestrians. And it's worth closer examination. If you look in the northbound tunnel, there is an elderly gentleman walking with a cane and one of those hats that, if you put it on, your daughters will ask you, are you really going to go out in that? He's walking away from you and away from the easel at which he's working. That's Mark Brunel. In the rowing boat above, there are two gentlemen with top hats, a couple of toffs. Neither is a Thames waterman. These are two posh boys out for sport. And if you look at the profile of the one in black, it's unmistakable. It's Isambard. Isambard was often up and down the river with his best friend William Hawes, who was there rowing. In the tunnel below, pointing, is William's elder brother Ben Hawes. Ben Hawes later became chairman of the Thames Tunnel Company and sold it to the railway in 1865. There have been trains running through it ever since. And next to Ben, his wife Sophie Hawes, née Brunel, because Ben Hawes married Mark Brunel's daughter. And her nickname, given her by Lord Armstrong, was Brunel in petticoats. Because the truth is, when she and her little brother were children, she showed more ability, more aptitude in things mathematical and technical and engineering than he did. If the man in the rowing boat is our most famous engineer, then the woman in petticoats promised to be a better one. A misfortune, she's born at a time when women have no such career possibilities. The tunnel was finally opened in 1843. Mark Brunel thought it would take him and his son 3 years to reach Wapping, the other side of the river. But it took 18 years. Men grew old and died building this tunnel. And though the tunnel was finished, the project was not. The idea was to move cargo underneath the River Thames, but they ran out of money. They couldn't afford to build the ramps to get the cargo into the cargo tunnel. And what they opened in 1843 was a very generously proportioned pedestrian tunnel, a cargo tunnel that couldn't take cargo. And this is the northbound tunnel, and if you notice, there are archways on the right. There's a northbound and a southbound tunnel, and there are 60 archways, and in each of archways they built a shop. You're looking at the world's first underwater shopping arcade. And in those shops they sold Thames Tunnel souvenirs. Thames Tunnel gin flasks, Thames Tunnel pincushions, Thames Tunnel snuff boxes, Thames Tunnel coffee cups, Thames Tunnel cigar cutters, Thames Tunnel nursery-ware. Not even babies escaped. If they had baseball caps, they'd have sold them. And this is a very early example of what is technically known as aggressive marketing of site-specific merchandise, or tourist tat, as you may have encountered it, which they sold fast and furious to the millions of visitors. On the first day this tunnel opened, in 1843, there were 50,000 visitors. By the end of the third month, there were 1 million. Now, that's a lot of people, but in 1843, that is half the population of London in the first 3 months. In 1843, London is the biggest city in the world. What you are looking at is, in its day, the world's most successful visitor attraction. And people came from all over the world because they didn't believe it. Because in 1843, the idea of walking under a river the size of the Thames is like walking on the moon. It's science fiction. People came because they wanted to be certain they weren't just reading nonsense. People came in their millions. They were mobbed. But the visitors only paid a penny. A Thames waterman would charge you a penny to row you across the river. You would pay a penny to walk across Old London Bridge with all the arches and all the shops. The fare for crossing the Thames is a penny. So they have millions of pennies. And the business plan calculated on toll. Toll from the East India Company and the other shipping agencies moving their cargo. But the ramps aren't built and the cargo can't get down there. So they're in trouble. So to try and make money in a different way, they sold souvenirs. And they're not just souvenirs. They are trophies. Millions came to see the tunnel. Not everyone was brave enough to walk through it. And some people went through the tunnel, but walking very briskly. It is about the midpoint that people begin to lose their nerve and start to run. But if you're really brave, then you stroll under the river and you browse in the shops. And there are 60, remember, 60 shops selling not just souvenirs, but proof. If you were brave enough to walk through the Thames Tunnel, you needed to take home proof. The ones who ran through had no time to buy anything. 60 shopkeepers down there explaining to you, the braver you are, the more you buy. You, sir, need an armful of souvenirs, trophies that say louder than words just how slowly and bravely you walked under the River Thames. And for the first time in the history of retail, real men shopped. This is the world's first macho shopping mall. And they did a very brisk trade. They never earned what they would have earned moving cargo through the tunnel, but business was good. Unfortunately, as the weeks went by, what opened as a shining avenue of light under the Thames became, by degrees, a little less shiny and a little less respectable. And people went down into the tunnel for all kinds of reasons. The tunnel became a haunt of thieves, cut purses, and what the books described as women know better than they should be. And of course this is bad for business. You cannot sell classy goods to classy women in Archway 36 if in Archway 37, though officially untenanted, there is the unmistakable noise of two people busy and energetically involved. And so the shops begin to close. And every time a shop closes, there's another dark corner under the river for dark deeds. And the tunnel becomes disgraceful. It becomes dangerous. It becomes libidinous. And the visitor numbers fall off. And there weren't enough visitors when they were mobbed. And now they're in more trouble than ever before. Which is why, in 1852, in an attempt to find another revenue stream, the Thames Tunnel Company organised the world's first underwater fairground. And where the trains now run, there were sword swallowers, fire eaters, magicians, Ethiopian serenaders, Indian dancers, Chinese singers, tightrope walkers. The sign, I don't know if you can read it, it says, "Troop of animals dancing and performing horses." God knows how they got the horses down the stairs. A whole section of the tunnel was decorated as a ballroom, and a steam-powered musical organ played waltzes under the River Thames. This was the best party in London. And this is the world's first underwater theatre. It is the entrance hall to the Thames Tunnel. And it is very grand. It is the grand entrance hall. These are staircases and arches that would grace an opera house or a theatre. But this is the entrance to the Thames Tunnel. And I should say that all these cards are available from me, with enticing stories written by the museum supporters. The story of the underground entertainment, which is what we're looking at, this story card is penned by Zoe Wanamaker, who points out that Brunel's grand entrance hall is exactly half the diameter of Shakespeare's globe. And points out further that her father, Sam Wanamaker, raised a globe theatre. Brunel sunk a brick caisson for, well, the traffic of the stage. I want briefly to talk about ships. I explained at the very beginning that Isambard, King of Brunel, is the man who built the world. I explained that he began our tube system, and he also changed the shape of the world with his ships. This you will recognise is the Bristol ship, the SS Great Britain, the first iron hull propeller-driven steamship in the world, and this is a picture of its launching. This, however, is the London ship, and forgive me if I say that vauntingly. This is the ship that changed everything. This is the first modern ocean liner, and you see it has a double hull. For the first time, it has a double hull. The Great Eastern has bulwarks from top to bottom, and uninterrupted walls from keel to top deck, unlike the Titanic. And we see in the Great Eastern, for the first time in marine engineering, we see engineering on an industrial scale. 30,000 plates were hammered into the hull of the Great Eastern. Each plate had 100 rivets. 3 million rivets were hammered into what they called Leviathan or Sea Monster, the biggest ship in the world. A ship so big it could steam from here to Australia and back again without refueling. A ship longer than his railway terminus at Paddington. 5 times bigger than anything else afloat. The biggest ship in the world, and the biggest ship in the world for 50 years. The next ship to go past it in size was the Lusitania. And the Lusitania's sinking, many say, is what brought America into the Great War. This is a monstrous ship, and it is the ship that changed everything. If you speak to marine engineers, they will tell you this is more important than the Great Britain. And this ship had paddle wheels like the Great Western, Brunel's first ship, and it had propellers like the Great Britain. And the paddle wheels are important. Huge ship, huge propeller. This is perhaps the most famous painting of the Great Eastern, Leviathan, by Parrott, and other ships by it, so you get some kind of idea of the scale. It was luxurious travel, which never quite materialised, because though it was a technological triumph, though it has changed everything, though it has, with the help of John Scott Russell, helped us understand that size does matter, that big ships plough through the billows and the waves, whereas little ships and boats bob up and down in them. Though it proved this and many other things, it was not financially successful. It was an unlucky ship. That famous photograph of Brunel standing in front of the chains is often seen as the iconic engineer. It's the engineer triumphant. The look on his face says, "I don't care how big it is, lady, I'll build it for you." But moments later, he collapses, and it is a story of tragedy and hubris as well. Moments later, he's taken back to his London home, to his sickbed and his deathbed. Isambard King of Brunel dies aged 43 years, and the ship that steamed from the Isle of Dogs did so without its occupant. On its maiden voyage to Southampton, I should say on the launch, those famous drums in front of one of them, Brunel is photographed, those famous drums were there to slow the ship down as it went down the launch ramps in the Isle of Dogs. It was not necessary. The ship's other nickname was the ship that doesn't like the water. It took them weeks to push it inch by inch sideways down the ramps on the Isle of Dogs. Those huge drums were there to slow the progress down, but they weren't necessary. But one of those drums broke free, and one of the iron staves that held it cartwheeled across the yard and impaled somebody. On its voyage to Southampton, there was an explosion. Someone had closed a valve that should have been left open, and one of the funnels blew off. 6 men scalded to death. This is a very inauspicious beginning. It was an unlucky ship. But everywhere it went, it turned heads. On its maiden voyage to New York, they lined Manhattan 50 rows deep to see this huge ship come up the river. And when it came up the river, it span on its own axis because it had paddle wheels as well as propeller. I have this picture in my head of 50 rows of jaws dropping. And it was the great event of the New York season. And they had the biggest party. Mind you, they had to. Because coming up the river, the ship had found, and not in a good way, Great Eastern Rock, which had troubled no shipping before because it wasn't big enough. Great Eastern Rock took a hole out of the hull 1/4 of the length, and they parted whilst divers repaired it. And then the ship steamed up, but it didn't sink. Then the ship steamed up to Halifax, where they had another party. Wherever this ship went, it turned heads, like the Thames Tunnel. This extraordinary piece of engineering opened to begin with as a visitor attraction. And people rode, people steamed on it in luxury and in style, and so they were able to say to others they had done so. This is the way to travel. But an unlucky ship, and never operated as they intended, never operated as an ocean liner, but it was commercially active for 25 years, which is a good record then, and a good record now. And it operated not just as a visitor attraction, but also as a cable layer. And a cable layer because it was the only ship big enough to take the cable to lay across the Atlantic. Brunel built many bridges, but perhaps the most important bridge he built was after his death, and it was the transatlantic cable. The Great Eastern laid the first 3 transatlantic cables. And this is the ship that many don't talk about. This is the Great Western. This is Brunel's first ship, but I put it before you because, in a way, this was the beginning for Brunel. He built the Great Western Railway to Bristol and told people he was not going to stop there. People pointed out that beyond Bristol was ocean. He said, I'll build a steamship to cross it. And the Great Western was the first purpose-built steamship to cross the Atlantic. The Great Western was the first ship to demonstrate what only Brunel knew at that time, which is you could build ships big enough to make long voyages and powered by steam. And there was a perverse kind of thinking which argued that any ship built to cross the Atlantic would need to be bigger to carry the extra coal. So where are you going to put the extra coal? Well, you'll have to build a bigger ship. So now the ship's bigger, so you need more coal to get across the Atlantic. So where are you going to put it? Well, you'll have to build a bigger ship. And you see how the circular argument progresses. Brunel was the first person to understand that a ship's capacity for carrying freight and coal increases as a cube, whereas its resistance through the water is increasing as a result, as a square. So this is an important discovery, the Great Western, and this is his first ship. And this is the Brunel Museum. This is the tip of the world's first underground theatre. This is the world's first caisson. This is a performance area, and the children, this is a very small museum in a residential area surrounded by community housing. The children have built their reinterpretation of that first slide I showed you, second slide I showed you, the bas-relief sculpture of the tunnel boring machine. And this is the interior of that extraordinary space. And the good news is that we are opening this space up. We have received a grant from the Association of Independent Museums, and later this year we will have built a proper doorway and a new staircase to get people down into this extraordinary space. You can gain access at the moment, and we take people down there 5 times a week on organised trips, but the entrance into this huge space, half the size of Shakespeare's Globe, the entrance into this huge space is just 4 feet tall, and descent is by temporary scaffolding staircase, as you can see. And this is outside the museum and above the Thames Tunnel. It is our recreation of the Fancy Fair, which was held first time in 1852 underneath the river in the tunnels that Mark Brunel, helped by his son Isambard, had created. This is the Thames Tunnel Fancy Fair of 2010, and it is my fervent belief that there will be many, many more. And this, to finish, is a poster from the first Fancy Fair. And the entertainments are fabulous, as you see. And there's the tightrope walk. You always need someone on the high line. Ladies and gentlemen, President, fellows and guests, I present to you Isambard Kingdom Brunel, son of the eminent Mark Isambard Brunel, the man who changed and built the world. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed for a total response in terms of the Brunel family and their achievements, and particularly, obviously, the major engineer that you all know. Now, there is time for some questions and or comments. We will adopt the normal habit of what we first presented, and then hopefully we'll be able to answer at least the majority of them.
Andrew Wilson, you make a great deal of the fact that Brunel, or Brunel's Freemen, were pioneers of various aspects of the modern world, including entertainment. I'm always struck by the fact that they had that charity dinner in the tunnel at a time when that would seem a little rash. And by the similarity of that event in some respects to the dinners that were held in other strange places, like the top of Nelson's column and in the belly of one of the Crystal Palace dinosaurs, which was in the process of being created. And I just wondered whether you would claim that Brunel invented the celebrity dinner.
I just want to ask that, assuming the money had been there, was the technology at the time in surveying good enough to allow them to start building both ends with a reasonable chance of meeting in the middle?
When they sold the tunnel, at the end of the day, did the investors get their money back, or was it all a financial disaster in the end?
Yes, thank you for your questions. Did Isambard Kingdom Brunel invent the celebrity dinner? Well, yes, of course he did. And at his celebrity dinner party, we had the Duke of Wellington and toasts to the King and the Duke of Clarence, his very well-heeled investors. There have been celebrity dinner parties in every tunnel ever built ever since, including the Channel Tunnel, including the Limehouse Link, and many others we could reel off now. And those, for certain, are a very conscious imitation of Brunel's underwater banquet of 1827. Actually, I'm not sure I can claim that he invented the celebrity dinner, but he certainly invented the celebrity underwater banquet. Was the technology and the surveying accurate and adequate for the time? No. I mean, they didn't meet in the middle because they only started from one end. I think they could have met in the middle, but on building the Thames Tunnel, it was only completed thanks to government help, and the government laid a lot of restrictions on how their money was going to be spent. And one of them was you cannot buy land on the north side of the river, and you cannot spend money on a little boat or a diving bell. You are only to spend money on digging the tunnel. And this is a fabulous piece of nonsense, because they could only dig from one end. They were working sometimes just 2-hour shifts. The further they got under the river, the worse the quality of the air, and miners just collapsed every 2 hours, were carried out and replaced by others. There were many who argued, including Mark Brunel, if you would allow us to sink a shaft on the north side of the river and cut a drift tunnel through, then there would be circulation of air, and the miners would be more efficient, and the shifts would be longer. So they were only allowed to tunnel from the south side of the river. And there was a survey, but it was taken from a small boat in the middle of the river and using an unprotected auger, so that when the thing was pulled up, you would not get a safe and uncontaminated sample as you would today in a survey. The worth of the survey is certainly questionable. So I think the answer to that is no. Brunel was let down by the inadequacy of surveying techniques at the time. What he did know was that just below the tunnel there was a 50-foot deep bed of quicksand. So he knew he had to keep above that. And in keeping above that, he went beneath the Thames and too close. Now today they would pressurise the workings, or they would freeze the workings, or they would pump in something called bentonite slurry to make everything gloopy and stiff and easy to drill through. None of those options were available to Brunel. He had to thread his tunnel above the quicksand and below the Thames. And this is not something to think about when you travel on the London Overground. But the crown of the tunnel in the middle of the river is 14 feet below the river bed. So he knew the quicksand was there. But someone once said to me, geology, well, everyone thinks geology is like a very well-made sandwich cake, but actually it's a badly made trifle. And what Brunel had to deal with in building the Thames Tunnel was badly made trifle. And the third question, when the tunnel was sold, did the investors get their money back? No, sadly they lost their shares. This was a hugely expensive project. £600,000 plus in 1843 is a great deal of money. And the only way they'd have got their money back is if they'd have got further investors interested in helping them build the cargo ramps. They would have made money if the tunnel had been used as a cargo tunnel. But the government did not fund a business proposition. What the government were funding, well, I suppose you'd call it a vanity project. Although I should qualify that. It was important for this tunnel to be finished, even though it was not a business plan that would hold water, forgive me. It was important that the tunnel was finished because in the 19th century, Britain marketed itself as the workshop of the world. If you wanted something built, if you wanted something done, the place to go to was Britain, where they do things and do things well. 8 years after the Thames Tunnel opened was the Great Exhibition, the world's first truly international trade fair. And the government provided, through the good offices of the Duke of Wellington, then Prime Minister, the government provided the tunnel with the money to complete, not because it was buying into a business proposition, but because if you could honestly continue to sell Britain as the workshop of the world, you couldn't have a half-completed tunnel right in the middle of the capital. So they lost their shirts, I'm afraid. It's a technological triumph. It is the oldest tunnel in the oldest underground in the world. It is the birthplace of the tube system. It is the first rudimentary tunnel boring machine, or TBM. The machines that today honeycomb our cities, that built the Channel Tunnel and that are building Crossrail, are simply automated versions of the tunnelling shield that Mark Brunel invented. This is not just the oldest tunnel in the world, it is the birthplace of the tube system, and it is where Brunel pioneered the technology and the method that has made world cities possible. I should say that if the Brunel Museum is the birthplace of the tube system, then it's the birthplace of the world city. Because world cities can only operate with a fast, efficient transport system to move people around the city once they have arrived. And Brunel has made that possible. Brunel has built the world, has changed the shape of the world, and has made mass transport and world cities possible. Both, yes, your new fellow is reminding me, Mark Brunel, assisted by his more famous son, Isambard Kingdom Brunel. There is a third Brunel, Henry Mark Brunel, son of Isambard Kingdom Brunel, grandson of Mark Brunel, and business partner of Sir John Wolfe Barry. Henry Mark Brunel, whom nobody talks about, with his business partner Sir John Wolfe Barry, built Tower Bridge to the design of Horace Jones. There are 3 generations of Brunels. There is a dynasty of engineers. That is, Julia, one more Brunel than there were Stevensons. Thank you very much.
Well,